Well, it's been a really wonderful event, and we're really pleased that you guys could be with us, and I'm really pleased that you folks are here and with us too. I hope it's been a blessing. One of the things about an event like this is that on a typical Sunday morning, a pastor is thinking about how to address a congregation made up of a wide range of people and ages. So the old saying is you need to have something on every shelf for everybody. That's one of the things you want to do. So there's something that maybe is a little bit intellectually challenging, that's kind of on the top shelf, and then there's a lot of cookies on the bottom for the kids, that kind of thing, if you get my drift. An event like this, we don't think in those terms. This is one of those opportunities to stretch people. So if you found yourself at different points being a little challenged, that was the idea. We weren't trying to make this super simple and easy to digest for anyone. What we hoped is that you would come away thinking, man, I need to learn a little more about that. I mean, that's just, I've never heard that before. Or a reference to an author. I should look into that writer or something like that. So if you've had that, that's a mark of success in terms of what we were hoping would happen. Anyway, so let's jump into this last conversation. And I'm just going to bring up some themes that I think we can all talk to or address. One of the things that both Aaron and Andrew brought up is the former director of the National Institutes of Health, Francis Collins. And you had things to say about him that were a little different, you know. Now, in terms of my own feeling on Francis Collins, I know his ghostwriter. I've known him for years. His name is Carl Giberson. He's one of the most liberal men I know. And he used to be an editor for Books and Culture, which is a publication of the Christianity Today sort of empire, right? Which should tell you something about Christianity Today and its empire. But my wife was his secretary for a while. So we go way back, like 30, 40 years. And when I learned that Carl was doing some ghostwriting for Collins, I said, I don't trust this Collins guy, because I know Carl. But a lot of folks didn't know about that. But you brought out, Andrew, the disappointment that you felt with this high-profile, elite evangelical and how he performed his job. But you, Aaron, brought up the fact that at least we have an evangelical in an elite position, and he was really good at his discipline. So I'd like to just kind of reflect a little bit on that. So why don't you just sort of spell out a little bit, Andrew, because you alluded to something but didn't get into the details.
Well, I think Aaron mentioned this as well in his talk, was the book To Change the World by James Davidson Hunter. That came out, I believe, in 2010. And, you know, James Davidson Hunter, a very storied professor at the University of Virginia, has always, I think, kind of situated himself as someone who wants to be an Orthodox Christian. He wrote a book in the late 80s, early 90s, kind of popularized the term the culture war. And he's always been kind of a Christian scholar speaking into the academy on these issues. But even, I think, James Davidson Hunter himself is kind of similar to the critique of his own model that he proposes with someone like Francis Collins. I'll come back to Hunter here in a second. You know, Hunter proposes the faithful presence model. And the idea is, and I think that I largely agree with his idea of how you change culture, and that's through elite networks, through kind of more or less a top-down style of leadership or influential and cultural change. And he says if Christians want to change the world, we need to think less like populists and more like elites. And to get to those levers of institutional power in order to leverage those for the good, and ostensibly doing so while you're a Christian. And listen, I am fully willing to accept that Francis Collins is a very storied scientist. I'm not going to speak on his credentials as a scientist. It's that he became the poster child in evangelicalism in the 2010s for what I think of is sometimes this evangelical inferiority complex. Like we're a little bit the Stuart Smalleys of the culture, that we're constantly looking for affirmation. Are we good enough? Are we smart enough? Gosh darn it, does someone like us?
That's right.
That is not what I hear Renn talking about.
Right.
But that's a concern about where the evangelical elite conversation can go. And so Collins gets into this role. He's heralded as the poster child for faithful presence. Okay, well, he's this elite scientist who was an atheist, becomes a Christian, writes provocative books on like the storyteller of our creation. In the process, he's overseeing an NIH where horrific, unspeakably evil grants are being signed off on pertaining to abortion. He has signed off institutionally on all of the LGBT pride ideology. He has seen as censoring Jay Bhattacharya, who Jay Bhattacharya now has Francis Collins' job. And we saw Francis Collins cavorting with Anthony Fauci through released emails, basically saying, we've got to silence this dissident here. So on several of the most important markers and measurements of cultural leadership and Christian leadership in culture, he failed. He failed doctrinally. I think he failed morally. And as we've seen what transpired with his kind of regime of censorship, he didn't serve the American people either. So I'm with Aaron. I'm not opposed to elites. To me, it's always going to be a question of whether or not the elites are worthy of the elite status that they get and whether they're going to be good elites while in office. And not becoming, honestly, just not becoming squishes.
Right.
All right?
So you would have been equally disappointed with an atheist or a Catholic. It's just this particular instance, we have an evangelical.
Well, yeah, and that makes it a little bit the irony more rich here, right? Well, we finally got the guy in the right mantle of power. Look how good it's going to go, which is another way of saying we can devise all of these formulas, but unless it's executed well, they're just formulas.
So just to kind of play out this a little bit, be a little bit of a devil's advocate on the point, there are lots of Roman Catholics that are really bad Roman Catholics who are in the elites, who through their behavior and even their influence actually seem to defy Catholic doctrine, but they're still kind of considered Catholics. Do we have to get comfortable with that idea if we're going to have evangelical elites?
Do you want me to answer this as a Protestant? So, I think this gets to the discipleship culture within Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. Protestants have traditionally been more word-oriented, more, I do think, from a sociological perspective, much more discipleship-oriented as a populist democratic reality, and that there is not in Protestantism an ethos like there is in Catholicism that says we have our official magisterial teaching, we're just going to ignore how it's actually practiced. So no, we should not become Catholics in that regard. And also, I want to defend someone like Ryan Anderson if he were sitting right here. Or Ryan Anderson would say the figures like Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden are also a discredit to Catholicism as well.
So Aaron, I'd like to, because you and I have talked a little bit about this in the past. Can you maybe elaborate on your thinking in this area? I know that you've used Francis Collins at least a couple of times that I can remember as an illustration of something that is a positive thing in terms of acquiring elite status.
Well, it's interesting. When I was a strategy consultant, this mentor of mine used to say that every strategy project has three parts. You can divide it into thirds. The first third is figuring out the problem. The second third is figuring out the solution. And the last third is figuring out how to communicate the solution. So I do spend a lot of time thinking about how to communicate this. And in this particular article, I'll just be the first to admit, I tried to write it in a way that like the cultural engager Kellerites would be open to what I'm saying. And so, they love Francis Collins. So I put him in there, and you notice I didn't affirm everything that he said. He's just in that position. And so that's kind of one thing. Secondly, I actually did a lot of searching. I was asking AI, asking these people, is there somebody else I can use in place of him that has similar eminence? And the answer was really no. Now, maybe I should have picked Jay Bhattacharya, who's also an evangelical, I believe. So maybe I could have put him in there. But it's like we're very, very thin on the ground, right, in a lot of ways. And even James Davison Hunter, I kind of subtweeting James Davison Hunter in my tweet when I talk about being willing to center your Protestant identity. He does not do that. As near as I can tell, I've looked, he has never publicly talked about, here's what I personally believe, here is my faith. It's sort of known that he's some kind of an evangelical, but he doesn't really do it. Again, I'm not gonna bash him. This guy's like paid a price for his work and his thing, and it's his choices. But I'm like, man, if he were Catholic, we would know I'm a Catholic. It would be like front and center in there. And so anyhow, but the point, I think the point is there, that's sort of why you put Collins in there. Certainly he failed in some ways, but I also think, this is where, the rubber meets the road on some of these things. If you're going to go into a position like head of the NIH, which, by the way, let's not forget, its primary purpose is curing disease. Okay, and so we want to focus on, different aspects of moralization. It's really, we're going to cure any diseases here. And I guarantee you, Jay Bhattacharya is going to have to do things that are contrary to Christian doctrine in some way. And so I think, we have to decide, like, and as a matter of conscience or theology, like, what are you sort of allowed to do and not do in different things? And I think, like the early church is like, well, we're not going to burn incense to Caesar. We're not going to say Caesar is a god. But there was relatively little attempt to disrupt the, structures of Rome, even with the, gross injustices of Rome. It didn't say, well, we're not going to pay taxes because the taxation system is unjust. And you can also think about people like Daniel or Joseph that are high up in these organizations, and they're trying to navigate through that. I'm not going to sleep with Potiphar's wife. I'm not going to eat these foods. Just what I'm going to pray to God. But other things. So I think it is complex in that. But I think you go into these things, it's like, I'm in the army now, and I'm being sent to Iraq. Does that meet just war theory? And so should I just go AWOL from the army? Like, I think there is a situation where, like, this sort of, and again, I don't pretend to have all the answers, but this idea that in sort of, the domains of the political, everything has to be done in like a hyper-moralistic way it makes you essentially incapable of participating in the political realm. It's like, because sometimes, you got to do things that maybe you didn't want to do, like ally with Stalin to defeat Hitler, and, so you end up there. And of course, Machiavelli talked about this. And so like say Machiavelli, but like, these are the kind of questions that we have to ask. And where I really have an issue is the highly selective nature in which some people like try to apply these rules. So of course, Francis Collins's buddies in kind of a lot of the evangelical world, never say a peep about any of the things that he does that's bad. But, if I am following the wrong person on Twitter, there are people right now on Twitter who like practically every day are out there trying to discredit, American Reform or other people because, you talk to somebody once, but then they don't say a peep about it. And they have all got far worse associations, in my opinion, and they never say anything. And so, I think and this is part of it, we have to be willing to, work with different kinds of people with different beliefs. It's a hard question. We need more thought on it, and that's what I would say.
Yeah, I'd like to revisit that in a minute, but I wanted to go to Nate. So When it comes to institutions that kind of onboard you into the elite, Harvard Law would be considered a good one. So you spent some time there. When it was, when you were there, were you thinking about things like that? If you were, as a Christian, how were you kind of working through it? And what did you hope would come out of it? Those sorts of things.
So Harvard Law absolutely is a institution that sends people that direction. What's interesting, and I think it'll actually ties into a point I want to make about Collins. I think the best critique of Collins might not be that he was sort of evil or morally bad, but that he was actually just bad at his job. He wasn't that good of an elite. You contrast him with Jay Bhattacharya, and Jay was right about things that Collins was wrong about. And so I think that in some sense you could say Collins was, if he's the model of what we should aspire to, we're also just not aspiring high enough. Fundamentally, he was a bureaucrat. He may have been a good researcher at one point, but he was really a bureaucrat. And what I noticed about the conservative organizations, the Federalist Society would be a good example at Harvard, is they really didn't. I found them unappealing. The Christian one even worse. I found them unappealing because they seemed to lack. The Christian one lacked ambition, which is a little surprising at Harvard Law School. It would be a sort of particularly unambitious group of Christians at Harvard Law. But even the Federalist Society, there's no real ambition, right? In some sense, they want you to almost be enslaved to a legal philosophy where ChatGPT could do it better than a human could do it. So are they really preparing you to be an elite where you are actually exercising that sort of human authority that I think is sort of a central aspect of what it should really mean to be an elite? And so I hung out with different groups of people, and now there's much better ones, I would say, at Harvard. But I would say part of it is we're not preparing people to exercise independent thought at a level that I think approaches sort of the statesmanship or the entrepreneur who's actually going to move society in a meaningful way. And if your idea of elite is you're a good bureaucrat, almost by nature you're sort of a slave to the system in which you operate. Whereas if your idea of what you should look to as an elite is perhaps an entrepreneur, perhaps an innovator, perhaps a sort of a paradigm shifter. If we believe that if we have Christians have major critiques of the current status quo, we should be pushing Christians to actually look at where they can come up with prophetic criticisms. I use prophetic in the very broad sense, in which case it could apply to science. And I found that. I find that lacking in almost all of the literature on what Christians talk about what it means to be elite, and that could go to the sort of faithful presence. It's not faithful prophet, and also I think the culture in the conservative circles in these institutions.
So it seems as though perhaps we have a problem even with willingness to, take a risk, kind of get outside of the ghetto that we live in. So,
and I think it is fair to say, like, Jay Bhattacharya took a big risk when he went against the public consensus on COVID.
Right.
And that's an example of, like, standing up and being unpopular. Right. And he proved to be right.
Was it the Barrington Declaration?
The Great Barrington Declaration.
Right. So let's think a little bit about this, getting out of kind of the comfort zone or the ghetto or whatever. One of the things I try to encourage, say, young Reformed guys who would like to write, what I try to encourage them to do is to become the token. And what I mean by that is you want to get into a place where you're the only Reformed guy. So you're like the guy that everybody looks to as the representative of the Reformed faith. Most guys, when they think about aspiring to a writing career, they think, I want to be where everybody's just like me. And it's kind of like there's like no room at the top because you have just no openings, like the Gospel Coalition. Like 500 guys who all want to publish, there. But if you're like the token, it's amazing what happens in terms of like opportunities and new things that come along. This ties into as well this whole point that you made, Aaron, about patronage. So in my own life, the people who have been most helpful to me are, in order, Roman Catholics, Jews, Eastern Orthodox, liberal Protestants, and Reformed, the bottom. So I'll give you an example. So we talked about Patrick Janine. Patrick's a friend of mine. We've been friends for probably 7-8 years. We met in a neutral space, which was Front Porch Republic. So a bunch of people who like Wendell Berry, and they're writing about him, right? So we made friends in that environment, and when his big book came out, I heard that he was going to be at Harvard giving a lecture, and I happened to be in Boston at that time. So I went up to Harvard and went to the coop, and his books were everywhere. You know, it was just like he was like a rock star. And then there was a place where he was going to be delivering the lecture. So I went to the location, and it was about 500 people in attendance, standing room only. Walked up to Patrick and said, hi. Anyway, so I went and took my seat. Halfway through the lecture, he stops it and says, that's C.R. Wiley over there. You need to buy his latest book. I'm going to tell you something. That's never happened to me in the PCA. And I don't think it ever will. And that's just one story. I've got others. So what is it about our little ghetto that doesn't encourage this kind of platforming?
Well, I do think some of it's related to just the very nature of populism, you know, and it's structured as these mafias, and it's like you're in this sort of new Calvinist mafia, and there's like the capos right at the top, and then there's like, you know, on down to the people, and you have to be completely loyal. You have to do everything that's said, and you know, maybe one day you'll get your own book, or you'll get a editor job at this thing, and you move up through the ranks, but like you never really get and become a capo yourself or a made man yourself, you know, unless of course you somehow, the way that you do it in evangelicalism is you have to plant an extremely large and successful church. Once you either build an enormous platform by some means, however you do it, church planting is one, then all of a sudden people will sit down with you, and it's kind of like that. But it is weird that everything is so insular within these various different tribes and fiefdoms and groups. And again, I would like to study it, but I think it's an artifact of populism, you know, where you're followers of a particular charismatic personality. You know, maybe back in the day it was watching Jimmy Swaggart on TV or something like that, or whatever. And so it creates a different sort of relationship than something else. I wish I could understand it myself, but it's very strange. You know, the dysfunctions in the nature and culture, the culture of evangelicalism is, it's like the scandal of the evangelical mind. There's so many of these little things that feed in here, but I do think the populist nature is a big explanation of how this works.
I agree with that. I would say, just in general, evangelicals tend not to think institutionally. I think the populist element is correct. I think the lowercase d democratic element is also correct. But if I can, you know, because you've raised the right question, why do we have no Protestants on the Supreme Court? That is a very important question to ask. What did I say?
No Protestants.
No evangelicals. There are Protestants.
Well, yeah, it's
Gorsuch is actually a convert to Episcopalianism from Catholicism, maybe kind of thing. And then I think Ketanji Brown Jackson is from a black church Protestant position.
So I think a part of the charge that I would give to us as evangelicals is to think just in general more institutionally. And the example I would give is that when I think about an institution that does institutionalism well as Protestants, of course I'm biased, you would expect me to say this. The institution where I teach, Southern Seminary, it's the oldest seminary in the Southern Baptist Convention. The Southern Baptist Convention is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. I'm not saying that to be braggadocious, I'm just trying to state like actual facts. So there are there are credentialing opportunities that come through storied institutions that are credentialing the right people to go lead in these other institutions. And when you look at a place like Southern Seminary, if you look at the leadership pipeline of someone like Albert Mohler, you can see a lot of leaders that have gone on from Southern to lead other entities within the Southern Baptist Convention. And because the footprint of Southern is large, it's trusted, and I say this cautiously because I'm suspicious of just trying to pursue elite status for the sake of being an elite. It has been the case that one of the functions of seminary life in the SBC was to form or to provide a place where young men who are getting educated can congeal and congregate in shared places and shared spaces that will then leave and go out and lead some of the denomination's largest entities and its largest churches, but they all know each other. And that's one of the things that I think I've seen done well in my context, is if you go and look at some of the most influential leaders in the SBC. I'm not saying everyone's perfect. This is not a PR campaign for the SBC. It's that there is an institutional footprint within Southern that I think has had ripple effects that transcend just the institution itself.
Right.
I want to make one other point because it raises it. I think there's another. I think the fact that we've had baby boomers running things for 30-something years is a big factor in that, because the boomers in general, forget about the evangelical world, the boomers in general have tended to want to hold on to power for a very long time, and they really haven't developed a bench under them. And it's really amazing, you know. Richard Lugar, former mayor of Indianapolis, senator from Indiana, all of these ultra high wattage people worked for him when they were young, like Mitch Daniels and all of that. And we've just seen far fewer of that today. And, you know, it's like, I think about, you mentioned Al Mohler because he was like 33 years old when he became the president of Southern Seminary. And, you know, if you think about the next generation, Generation X, Russell Moore, when he was in the SBC, maybe like the fastest burner of his generation, was about 10 years older when he got a much less prestigious and well-endowed thing. So the pathway to even getting anywhere is just much, much, much longer. The idea that they would, you know, when Al Mohler retires, they're going to hire a 33-year-old that's going to be empowered the way that he was empowered. I just think the social dynamics of our society are very different in that regard. Like, it's kind of, the boomers have been, there's been sort of some jam up in society as a result of the boomers. They got put in positions of authority very young, and they've, you know, they're healthier than previous generations, you know, they're not dying young as much, and so they've been around a long time, right. And there you go, that's part of it.
So Aaron and I both contributed to a symposium on boomerism for the American Reformer, and the title of my article was Die, Boomer, Die. So anyway, I'm technically a boomer, but in spirit, I'm Gen X, but anyway. Anyway, I'd like to think a little bit about turning institutions around, because now we're kind of getting into something that you noted was very hard to do and hardly ever happens, particularly in the academy. So again, another anecdote. I was in Boston when Southern was being blown up, and I remember one of the refugees who came to Boston to plant a church was a former faculty member there, but he was one of the liberals who was encouraged to go away. So he would commiserate, and I would, in my heart of hearts, I didn't actually say this to him, but I said to myself, I think Mohler was right. But doing that sort of thing requires a kind of edge and sort of a steely spine. And we don't develop leaders like that much. In fact, it's all about kind of being a sort of person that everybody would feel comfortable around. Everybody would say, well, you know, he's tender-hearted. He may be incompetent, but he loves everybody, you know, as opposed to, like, he really knows what he's doing and he's not putting up with anything. And so let's think a little bit about that. one of the things I know American Reformer would like to do is encourage that kind of transition and renewal and really kind of ditch hard work, not just in the Baptist world, but more broadly. Does this relate to anything that you're hoping that like New Founding and American Reformer can accomplish, Nate?
So absolutely, that going to that question of what we should think about as an elite is it's not someone who can reach the top position, but it's really someone who can move the institution in a meaningful sense. That should be the aspiration. Those are the people who sort of, in a sense, matter in society. And I think if we were stewarding something that was in very good shape, it might be very different, right? If you're trying to keep it in order. I go back and forth on how institutions get moved. I would say my general thesis is they get moved probably as much from the outside as the inside. So I think it's New Founding. It's more likely that entrepreneurs who build new. I guess going to sort of one explanation for the problems within evangelicalism, why they're not building other people up, for instance, is the politics are so nasty because the stakes are so small.
I've heard that.
Often applied to academia writ large, but it's a very zero-sum space where, like, how much glory can you, if you're not actually doing great research, as an example, if you're producing great research output during the sort of golden eras of sort of physics development, it's not zero-sum. There's things building on each other. But if you're actually trying to get peer-reviewed credit, but you're not actually innovating that much, then it's really a zero-sum mindset toward credit. And I think that the evangelical world, in many ways, is sort of a very zero-sum mindset towards status.
So in other words, the more you shine, the worse I look.
You can only get it by taking market share from other people rather than by building something new. And so I think there's my instinct is the way these institutions will move will not be sort of gradually moving them through a sort of internal approach, but it'll be things that really it'll be entrepreneurs who build things that are very influential, maybe very powerful, maybe very profitable, who in turn are able to use that to sort of pull other in some cases those new institutions will come to supplant the old ones. In some cases that may just be a new base that is anchored in a very different direction. They can then sort of pull the older institutions along in any number of ways, whether that means bringing in the equivalent of a Moeller, who's a young guy who now has an outside benefactor who can provide the base needed to because ultimately you can't. It's not simply a matter, I think, of having the will to do that, but you also need the power to do that. If you don't have the power, you're not going to be able to fire powerful people.
Well, let's think a little, because I remember, Aaron, you did something not so far back on a similar thing that occurred in the Lutheran world, if I'm remembering right. Do you know what I'm referring to?
There was a similar situation in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod where they had seminaries that were going liberal in the traditional liberal Protestant sense of the world, historical criticism, all of that. And there was a group of people that essentially I think they were the model for the SBC conservative resurgence in a sense. And they managed to fight back, take over the denomination, take over the seminary. It was Concordia Seminary, St. Louis. And the students walked out, the faculty walked out. 95% of the faculty ended up basically fired and leaving. It was like half the student, but they lost a huge percentage of their people. But they were able to rebuild because they actually controlled the institution. And I'm not as up on that. The definitive story of that has yet to be told because the wounds are still too raw, I think, within that. To talk about it. Most of what's been written has been written by the losers. But I just thinking about Al Mohler, I think about, okay, I'm 33. I'm at SBC. I'm the president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And I see it as I am empowered to restructure the structuring in order. I'm going to restructure this institution. And I'm going to fire all these old people that are a lot older than me. And, obviously he had the power. It's like, the trustees backed him. He had that commissioning, and he was able to do it. And that's a perfect example of what I call structuring and ordering and doing those things. And it's not always easy to be in a position to do it, but how few people would do it. I mean, And I think the baby boomers, to their credit, we're kind of institutionalist, enormous self-confidence. The boomers have enormous self-confidence. When Donald Trump says, "I alone can fix it," that sort of sums up a lot of it. But you have to have that kind of self-confidence to start like rearranging the pieces on the game board like that. And I think Gen X doesn't like to run institutions and is very timid. We like to sit on stage and banter analytically about things. And so I feel like
maybe I am a boomer.
Yeah. But no, I think what Moeller did is a good example, and I don't know generationally how it played out, but like what happened in the Luther case. And and there's been a similar case actually ongoing in the Christian Reformed Church, where there's sort of been a conservative resurgence there, as a group of just confessionalist, kind of dispositionally moderate, but kind of confessionalist people just methodically kept saying, we're going to just do what our confessions say. If you don't like, and then eventually like a bunch of the liberal churches are leaving, including many of the most historically prominent congregations, and that, which is like, wow, this never happens.
So this brings up the point of having the courage to actually follow through. And when it comes to, say, the trustees, so let's go back to Moeller and the trustees there at Southern. If I remember correctly, this was a much larger kind of movement within the SBC, and this was just kind of the application of its program at that place.
Yeah, I mean, it was actually considered, I think his election to president was considered the symbolic end of the conservative resurgence. That was in 1993. It began in 1979. So you're thinking about shifting long-term institutional dynamics. It took 14 years. It took learning the procedures and the processes to do that. But I think it was Aaron who mentioned last night about the need for courage in all of this. Risk and courage. I've been fortunate to get to know Dr. Moeller, work very closely with him. He has more scar tissue built up,
I bet,
than any other human being I've ever met. I recall one time he was just getting unrelentingly attacked on X, and I'll sometimes go to him and say, "Hey, I'm just making sure you're aware of this," and he'll say, like, "I don't care."
Right.
And when he says, like, "I don't care," he's not meaning that flippantly.
Right.
He means literally, I'm not concerned about what's going on social media. That person's been thinking the same thing for the last 30 years. It is what it is.
This is just the opportunity to get me.
Right. But then the other element in all of this is he would tell you, if he were sitting here, that when he became president, he was willing for the institution to die.
Right.
If it meant the institution going down in a blaze of glory. So he had the tenacity, he had the patience, he had the courage, but he also had the risk-reward mentality to know that we could reorient the institution around the abstract principles like it was designed to do in the first place, and we may never recover. And that was something that he had made a peace with, and then he was not going to make peace with accommodation if that meant giving the liberals further tentacles to reach in and control the institution.
Better dead than red.
Right. Yeah, that's good. So I want to change the subject here a little bit. In your talk, Andrew, you mentioned Hauerwas. Now, I knew who you were talking about. This is Stanley Hauerwas. He taught at Duke for years. He was a friend of Will Willimon, and they wrote a book entitled Resident Aliens. So I knew Willimon. I remember the last time I saw him was in a Chinese restaurant in Cambridge. We had lunch. But he's wacko liberal now. I don't know if he's so woke, I wouldn't even recognize him anymore. Back in those days, he was like kind of a moral conservative, social conservative, but he's not that anymore, which, anyway. But fill us in on Hauerwas, because you were kind of like tripping out on us on Hauerwas there for a while, and every other word was Hauerwas this, Hauerwas that.
Yeah, I was aware that talking about Hauerwasianism at this conference might be met with some furrowed brows, like, what's this guy talking about? What I would say is the last 20 to 25 years, I feel like, of a lot of mainstream evangelicalism has been captured and regurgitating elements of Hauerwasian aspects to ecclesiology. And the short story with Hauerwas is he thinks of the church as a counterpolis, as a counter society, and that the way the church demonstrates the gospel is to live in radical contrast to the norms of liberal democracy. So the church needs to be committed to nonviolence. The church needs to be committed to radical autonomy. And there are some aspects of his thought that you can find some redeeming elements in, obviously. But the notion that, political involvement is itself compromised, because to get entangled with the affairs of the world is to play on the grounds of coercion, and coercion is totally contrary to the gospel.
He's literally an Anabaptist, right?
He's an inconsistent Anabaptist, but yes.
Yeah, and teaching at a Methodist school.
Yeah. And so I think, looking backwards, and I say this from the perspective of my own biography. When I was in college, you're wanting to kind of read what you think is edgy theology at the time, and I was in that stage where I'm kind of wanting to rebel against the religious right of the strictures that I've grown up within. So you're just looking for the new edgy thing. And so I'm reading Hauerwas, and I'm like, yes, this is the type of pure Christianity that I need. Constantine is the villain, and the church needs to forsake political power, and it just needs to be a contrast, radical counter community. And I really do think the last 25 years of evangelicalism has more or less been in the shadow, not of the religious right and the moral majority as the media would have you believe. I think functionally it's been the spirit of Hauerwasianism, which has led to this idea within many sectors of Protestant political theology that involvement with the public square is the idolatry of power, the idolatry of politics. It leads to, I think, slowly ceding moral responsibility to the world. And that's one of the attractive features of Hauerwasianism. It allows you to evacuate from the public square and to do it with a high-minded, look how holy I am, because I'm not going to get entangled with the affairs of the world. I'm going to focus on the church being the church. Meanwhile, our society is just careening off the rails, and there's no moral voice in the center of society, namely the church, that's willing to speak up and be a prophetic voice.
Yeah, it implies that we don't have a real role in helping to basically demonstrate love through political means, that politics itself is so irredeemable, so filthy, that we can't permit ourselves to be stained by it. Right? So what kind of mindset do we need? So the cataton, we were talking about this among ourselves here a little while back, the idea of a restraining influence. We see this in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, where the cataton is said to restrain the Antichrist. So if we think a little bit about that, what does that call for? I mean, are there some things that we need to be willing to do that are perhaps hard to maybe, hard for maybe people watching from the outside to understand? So for example, if we think about what Moeller did firing all of those guys, I'm sure there were families who were affected, mortgages that couldn't get paid, all kinds of things that he didn't necessarily set out to do or to have these people have to experience, but it's just kind of the consequence of having to do a hard thing. So how do we resolve all of that? How do we work with that?
I'll say one thing at a theological level, and I'll let the tacticians answer this more practically. I mean, theologically, we have to live in view of Genesis chapter 3 and Romans chapter 8. Evangelicals oftentimes want to think everything started and stopped in Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 and 2 shapes the forward horizon of what we're wanting to see repristinated in terms of culture, but to get to Genesis 1 and 2, you have to go through Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3 promises conflict and fallenness woven into the storyline of the current era of redemptive history that we're in. And the very best of evangelicalism is that it sees things in clear moral binaries. And that's a good thing that I want to applaud. At the same time, that can lead to a failure of understanding right accommodations that have to be made in order to play within fallen political orders. I've been reading, I'm working on a book right now, and I've been reacquainting myself with some of Niebuhr. What was helpful about Niebuhr is that he was, at the end of the day, a political realist. He was guided by a set of universals, but he recognized to accomplish those universals, it's often going to be done using the proximate means of justice, meaning you may not get the full totality of full political justice, but you're trying to get as much as you possibly can, and understanding that in a fallen age, the good emerging is harder to do because fallenness more easily manifests,
So we are going to have to get our hands dirty, in other words. So how do we go about putting ourselves in a position to do things that are hard to do and then maybe not being understood? I think that's one of the things. So if you have a lot of folks who are just mad at you all the time because Uncle Bob was fired, and it ruined our lives but saved the seminary, how do you live with that kind of stuff? So I'm not just looking at you, Andrew, but I'm just looking at you other guys as well. I mean, how do we think about these things? How do we live with this kind of stuff?
I'll jump on. I'll say, I think responsibility. Fundamentally, the question is, do you have a greater responsibility to, I would say there's two things I'll say. One is the church needs to shift in a way that is more supportive of elites doing that, I think. I think Andrew pointed out that sort of a tendency of the evangelical church is moral binaries. But I think that often is expressed in a form of moralism that actually makes it very, very easy to, I would say moralism and legalism and biblicism they're all egalitarian tools in a sense. They're all tools by which sort of any person can find fault with a leader who's making the decisions in the arena. You don't have to be in the arena to exercise those. So you could argue in a sense they're enemies of authority. And I think you see them often in populist traditions. I'll get to I'll just touch on a very sort of hot button issue that roils a lot of the church today, and how I have some ideas about how it can be addressed, which I think relate to answering this question. But you have a lot of debates around, you've obviously had the debates in D.C. around Kevin Roberts and Tucker and Fuentes. You have debates around the questions around the Jews and how those are handled that certainly have, I think, roiled a lot of the online, the Christian right today. I think my view is that a moralistic discussion of those sorts of topics involves a lot of finger wagging and involves a lot of condemnation. I think those are unhelpful from both sides, and I think we do have tools, but I don't think evangelicals are very good at those tools. I think the solution is actually a re-establishment of the idea of authority. You don't have to judge. I don't have to morally condemn people who are saying things that are wrong. Sometimes there are complicated questions where I'm not even certain what the right answer is. But it's fine for authorities who exercise authority to make a judgment that this is how we're going to do things here. And that's in some sense that's sort of an easier, that's a more humble statement, right? It's more Christians can settle for I am responsible for this institution. This is how we're going to run things. I'm not trying to judge the whole world. At the same time, the whole world shouldn't be able to judge me for that decision either, because ultimately that decision has to be it's a prudential decision grounded in responsibility for this institution. And I would say, I think the discourse on these hot button topics threatens to tear apart our movement, tear apart the church, probably one of the most high stakes questions of our time. I would say in many ways you could say Charlie Kirk was a catatonic figure in that he was able to hold back a lot of this debate by having a lot of credibility on both sides, and I think despite being fairly young, having a lot of wisdom about how to handle it. And after he died, after he was assassinated, it really did lead to a lot of debates that threatened, I think, to tear apart the movement. What is the solution? The solution is more figures who have both judgment and authority and responsibility. They're willing to step in and touch these issues in ways that are risky, but rather than sort of exacerbating that risk by having a church that I think rushes to moralistic condemnation, or even you could say sort of moralistic distancing, right? You talk about the Hauerwasian views. You might not quite condemn someone for saying something complicated, but you sort of distance yourself and imply that Christians can distance themselves and imply that they're more sort of pious for not really getting into those sort of just questionable topics. We need a church that affirms the good of responsibility, affirms the good of the man in the arena, exercising that statesman-like judgment, and I think for the people to do so, to have a very strong sense of responsibility.
I think that's a great place to call the panel discussion a wrap. There's a lot of things I'd like to talk about, but we've come to that time that we designated that we'd stop. So why don't we do that? The old joke when it comes to like writing a dissertation is have the courage to finish. So anyway, I'm exercising some leadership here, and we're going to finish. So James, come on up.